Last time we spoke about the battle for Tianjin. Tianjin had been relieved momentarily of its siege, but the Boxers and Qing forces quickly went back to work assaulting the foreign-held part of the city. Forces from the great powers began arriving at Daku, heading for Tianjin to finally lift its siege once and for all. The battle against the Chinese-held part of the city was to be the bloodiest battle of the Boxer Rebellion, and it was the Japanese who ushered in victory. The southern and eastern gates of Tianjin were breached as the foreign troops sent the Qing and Boxer forces fleeing. Now with Tianjin firmly in their hands, and with even more troops arriving by the day, the new 8-nation alliance was preparing for a march upon Beijing. Would this new international force be able to get to Beijing quickly enough to save the besieged foreign community there? This episode is the Boxer Rebellion Part 6, The Fall of Beijing. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you were still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Check out my episode on the Ramri Island Massacre myth. I assure you, it's pretty entertaining. Also, if you ever have a chance, check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel for exclusive podcasts. This month's exclusive podcast is on Tomoyuki Yamashita, and how he became the Tiger of Malaya. Check it out, it means a lot to me. German Field Marshal Alfred von Waldersee was chosen to be the Supreme Allied Commander, but he was in Germany, with his soldiers set to depart on August 18th. Meanwhile, Lieutenant General Sir Alfred Gassely was at Tianjin, and he managed to get the Americans to back him temporarily to be the leader of the new 8-nation alliance. I would like to note, General Yamaguchi Motomi was the highest-ranking officer present at Tianjin during this time, but non-white racism disallowed the other commanders to allow him to take command. It was estimated by most of the great powers that some 50,000 to 70,000 troops would be necessary to march upon Beijing. Gassely had 22,000. 10,000 Japanese, 4,000 Russian, 3,000 British, 2,000 Americans, 800 French, and 200 Germans, 100 Austrians, and 100 Italians. Telegraph lines were cut, the railway was damaged, and many of the great powers advised waiting for more troops before marching. But the British and the Americans threatened to go it alone if they did not march at once. Back over in Beijing, the truce had gradually died down, and now the foreigners lived in a confused kind of paradox. At one moment, the Zhanglia men would send them gifts of food and assure them protection. The next, they were plotting their death. The hostilities had resumed while the Zhanglia men began publicly stating any soldier caught firing on the legations would be beheaded. It was unbelievably contradictory. Rumor had it that Li Hangzhang had been appointed the negotiator for peace talks, and he would soon send telegrams to the foreign governments. On August 12th, Prince Ching sent a message indicating the Zhanglia men intended to have a meeting with the ministers the very next day. The foreign community hoped this meant a relief force was close to Beijing and that the Qing were now panicking. They had all received information 2 days prior from General Gassely stating, "Strong force of allies advancing. Twice defeated enemy. Keep up your spirits." They had also received a message from General Fukushima stating, "Probable date of arrival at Peking, August the 13th or 14th. The legation defenders' morale had thus boosted considerably, but they were still under a violent siege, taking the lives of people every day. Bullets and shrapnel peppered them each day, and the Qing forces seemed even more aggressive, planting their banners just 20 yards away from the defenders' outposts. In fact, some of the banners bore the name of a general they had not heard of until this point. It was our old friend, Yu Xian. Yuxian had been appointed governor of Shaanxi province, and he reigned a campaign of terror against Christians and foreigners there. On July the 9th, it was rumored Yuxian had executed 44 foreigners, including women and children from some missionary families, whom he had personally invited to the provincial capital, Taiyuan, under the guise he was going to protect them. Now, it is disputed by historians who exactly the actual culprits were who killed the foreigners, but the incident became known as the Tianjin massacre. What is known, by the later half of the 1900s, Shaanxi saw as many as 2,000 Christians murdered. It seemed Empress Dowager Cixi brought Yuxian over to Beijing as a last-ditch effort to overrun the foreigners. The tenacity of the besiegers had increased exponentially, as told to us by Lennox Simpson. All thoughts of relief have been pushed into the middle distance, and even beyond, by the urgent business we have now on hand. What stupendous quantities of ammunition have been loosed off on us. What tons of lead and nickel. Some of our barricades have been so eaten away by this fire that there is but little left, and we are forced to lie prone on the ground hour after hour. The Chinese guns are also booming again, and shrapnel and segment are tearing down trees and outhouses, bursting through walls, splintering roofs, and wrecking our strongest defenses more and more. The commanders of the Gasly force figured they would be facing around 70,000 Qing soldiers and anything between 50 to 100,000 Boxers between them and Beijing. There was some Japanese cavalry, but their horses turned out not to be able to face the heat. 60 out of 400 of them would not even make it to Beijing. So they were going to be mostly an infantry force. The commander chose to take the exact same route to Beijing that the British and French took during the Second Opium War. It's rather fitting, if you ask me. They departed on August the 4th, and the first battle they would face was at Beijing. Their intelligence reported General Dong Fuxiang had deployed roughly 20,000 troops at Beijing, though in reality it was around 11,000. The British, Americans, and Japanese advanced along the western side of the river, while the French and Russians marched on its east. As the army approached Beijing on August the 4th, they camped outside near the Xigu Fort Arsenal, the very same arsenal Seymour and his expedition had come across. The commanders planned to have the British, Americans, and Japanese turn to the right flank of the Ching, while the Russians and French turned their left flank on the opposite side of the Hui River. At 3 a.m., the Japanese launched their attack under the cover of an Allied artillery bombardment, and they quickly seized a Qing battery on the extreme right of their defensive lines. They then pushed forward on the flank as an artillery duel between the Qing and the Allies raged on for about half an hour. During the duel, a Japanese regiment performed a direct assault on a Qing position along the river. The Japanese requested some cavalry aid from the British, but it failed to reach them in time, leading the Japanese to take very heavy casualties. Nonetheless, the Japanese stormed some Qing entrenchments, forcing the defenders to retreat. Over on the eastern bank of the Hui River, the French and Russians were unable to hook around the Qing left flank due to some flooded terrain, but the Japanese victory in the west broke the Qing's will to fight as a general retreat was sounded. The Allies had lost 60 men dead, all Japanese with 240 wounded. Around 50 Qing were killed in the battle that lasted until 9 a.m., and it was a relatively easy victory, though the Japanese did pay heavily for it. American medics notably treated the Japanese wounded. The Qing forces retreated 12 miles back to Yangcun, where they would take up positions between the east bank of the Hui River and the railroad embankment. Yangcun was heavily fortified, and the Qing forces were led by generals Ma Yuquan and Song Qing, hoping to halt the Allied advance there. The British and Americans took the vanguard this time, advancing on Yangcun by August the 6th. The Japanese advanced along the western side of the Hui River, but would not find themselves taking part in this battle. And I will just point out, they did that on purpose this time. They kind of felt like they were slighted in the last battle. The Qing numbered nearly 11,000, though it's unknown how many actually took part in the battle. The Allies faced something different that was nearly as bad as bullets that day: tremendous heat. Indeed, during the Gasly expedition, the weather often reached 42 degrees, or 108 freedom units for you Americans. 20% of the men who marched on Yangtze fell out of rank, and a ton of sunstroke-related deaths occurred. The Allied forces advanced within 5,000 yards of Qing positions. The Russians were on the easternmost, followed by the British and the Americans. The assault began at 11 a.m., and soon it became an endurance competition between both sides. Men clutched their water canteens as they marched. The Americans bore the brunt of the Qing resistance as they hit the strongest held position behind the railroad embankment. Men were seen collapsing from sunstroke as Qing artillery and rifle fire poured upon them. The Americans were advancing in open terrain and had to run to avoid being hit. As the Americans charged over the railroad embankment, they would find most of the positions abandoned. The battle ultimately became one enormous rearguard action. As the Americans advanced so rapidly, the British and Russian artillery began to mistake them for retreating Qing forces and started to shell them. These men that they were mistaking to be the Qing were the U.S. 14th Infantry. 4 Americans would be killed and 11 wounded as the Americans frantically signaled back to stop the shelling. Placing a handkerchief on a point of a sword, an American commander galloped up to the embankment, waving it over at the artillery fire. To make matters even worse, upon seeing the shelling, the French joined in, also firing upon them. By the late afternoon, the battle for Yangtze was all but over. The Qing took very few casualties as they had abandoned their positions fairly early on. The Americans had 9 deaths, 64 wounded, 15 of which died later on. The British had 6 deaths, 38 wounded. The Russians, 7 dead, 20 wounded. Within Yangtze, the Allies found the trains Seymour's expeditionary forces had abandoned, as told to us by Frederick Brown. Still standing on the embankment were the boilers and wheels of the engines used in that fruitless attempt to reach Peking. How the Boxers must have gloated in their hate when they rushed upon these inventions of the foreign devils. They had burned the woodwork, looted the braces, the nuts and bolts, and had even torn up and buried the rails and sleepers. But the wheels and boilers remained there in defiance. The route to Beijing was nearly a treeless plain. The landscape was littered with the fields of 14-feet-high corn. It was actually terrifying because one could not see over the cornfields for possible enemies lurking about. On one occasion, Lieutenant Rogers Keyes of the HMS Fame was horrified to see the banners of a large body of Tartar cavalry and the pennons of our Bengal lancers showing above the standing maize, and within a mile of another, apparently unaware of each other's proximity, but closing in fairly rapidly. Keyes galloped over to warn the Bengals, but it was like finding a needle in a haystack. The Japanese actually began carrying bamboo ladders so that they could peek over the corn, which must have been silly as hell to watch. The heat was a constant enemy. As commanding officer of the U.S. 14th Infantry, Colonel Daggett recalled, "There was a fierceness in that. China's sunrise, which none had experienced in the tropics or our southern states during the Civil War. Its prostrating effect was unaccountable and caused our men to fall by hundreds. The dust of ages rose at every footstep. The corn obstructed the breeze and did not allow it to either blow away the dust or fan the burning faces of the fainting soldiers. The men would abandon countless blankets, greatcoats, haversacks, and such along the roads. Even the British Indian troops were suffering from the heat. Lieutenant Steele remarked, "The heat was awful, the whole road being littered with men fallen out. Americans, Japs, and ours. The country is so dense with crops we couldn't see anywhere, and the flies and bad water made life pretty sickening. Everywhere one came across dead bodies of Chinese and mules and horses in various degrees of foul composition. I nearly vomited dozens of times." Despite the conditions, the 8-nation alliance marched 25 miles and won 2 easy victories. After a council of war on August 7th, the commanders had all agreed to continue the march and not to wait for reinforcements. The Italians, Austrian, and Germans had returned to Tianjin to re-equip themselves as they had greatly miscalculated the gear needed for the expedition. Many French likewise would have to turn back. The field was thus set for the Russians, British, Japanese, and Americans to push on. The Ching who saw them march would simply flee, seeing countless villages abandoned along the way. In some villages, a few Chinese civilians would be found, and as noted by Daggett, the villages were all deserted, except occasionally a Chinese man or woman would be found crouching in some hidden corner, expecting to be killed at any moment. And, to the disgrace of humanity, some of these innocent, unresisting people were shot down like beasts, but not by Americans. British journalist Henry Savage Landor, traveling with the expedition, would write, "The majority of the American boys were, as a rule, extremely humane, even at times extravagantly gracious towards the enemy." Henry would also go on to claim his countrymen showed more humanity than the other nationalities. Many prisoners were taken, some Qing troops, some Boxers. The Chinese regiment was in charge of prisoners, but the other troops sometimes grabbed prisoners and abused them. Henry wrote of how a Boxer prisoner was dragged away by some French and Japanese troops and shot in the face. The poor devil, who showed amazing tenacity of life, afterwards had all of his clothes torn off him, the soldiers being bent on finding the peculiar Boxer charm which all the Boxers were supposed to possess. The man lived for another hour, with hundreds of soldiers leaning over him to get a glimpse of his agony, and going into roars of laughter as he made ghastly contortions in his delirium. On August the 8th, a message came back from MacDonald to Generals Gasly and Chelfie. The message was accompanied by a map of Beijing, advising them to enter Beijing through the southern gate of the Chinese city, then to advance up the main street before turning towards the Tartar Wall. MacDonald promised they would mark positions on the Tartar Wall with American, British, and Russian flags to try and help them out. Unfortunately, the notes were written in a cipher, but the Gasly force had left that back in Tianjin. Captain Griffin of the 1st Bengal Lancers was given the task of running back to Tianjin to get it deciphered. The army found themselves halfway to Beijing at the town of Haoshiwu. There they found written plans that the Qing forces sought to flood the countryside and drown them out. Lieutenant Colonel Vaughan of the 7th Rajputs recalled, "We found the cutting nearly completed and the workmen's tools and baskets lying in it, so precipitately had fled. However, although the thing didn't come off, the Chinese general informed his government that he had cut the banks of the Baiho and inundated the country, drowning 25,000 of the foreigners, at which he naively concluded, 'They are much disheartened.'" We read this account of our being drowned some months later in a Chinese paper, and we were much amused. On August the 12th, the Allies came across the sealed gates of Dongchao. The Qing garrison fled upon their arrival, to which Frederick Brown would write, "As we followed the retreating army, we came across pots, pans, umbrellas, and fans, the necessary paraphernalia of a Chinese army, scattered about in all directions. It seemed, therefore, that there would be no serious stand till Peking should be reached." The southern gate of Dongchao was blown up. Allies poured in, began looting. Gasly tried to control the men and reassure the local population who were terrified and hiding in their homes. Meanwhile, Li Binghong, who had promised to repel the foreigners at the first sign of battle on August the 11th, wrote to Empress Dowager Cixi his apologies, and after the fall of Dongchao, Li Binghong killed himself. On the 12th, the commanders held another war council. General Linievich of the Russians argued they would be too exhausted to perform an assault upon Beijing immediately upon the arrival. The other commanders agreed to a 3-phase operation. Each nation's army would send a cavalry reconnaissance on the 13th, followed by the main bodies expected to arrive on the 14th, and then a general attack would commence on the 15th. The French commander, General Frey, had just returned to the force with an additional 400 French troops from Tianjin, thus making 5 national armies. The general attack called for a simultaneous advance with each national contingent aiming for a particular gate on the eastern walls of Beijing. The Russians took the furthest north position on the right flank, then the Japanese, the French, then the Americans, and at last the British on the southernmost left flank. Their intelligence reported the Ching were concentrated on the south and southeast portions of the city. Thus, Gasly had chosen to have the British take the most exposed position. The Russians were assigned the Dongju Gate, the Japanese Chaoyang's Gate, the Americans Dongbian's Gate, and the British the Guangzhou Gate, while the French were simply left out of the planning altogether. A move I would highly support. On the evening of the 13th, rumors suddenly emerged that the Russians were breaking the plan and making for a wild dash at Beijing, as told to us by Keys. A message had just come from the Russians that some Cossacks had pushed on within a mile and a half of Peking, and that the gates were already open. I wonder if it is true. If so, we are properly left behind. Now, what actually occurred is a little bit unclear, but Russian scouts were well ahead of everyone else on the night of the 13th, and they sent word that the Dongbian Gate, the gate that the Americans were to attack, was very lightly defended. General Linievich sent a vanguard under General Vasilevsky with some artillery to secure the approach to Dongbian. Apparently it was Vasilevsky who saw an opportunity, so instead of waiting, he simply charged with his men over the moat bridge, taking 30 or so Qing defenders by complete surprise in their outer guardhouse. The Qing tried to raise an alarm, but it was far too late as Russian artillery blasted a hole right through Dongbian's gate, and before dawn of the 14th, they were the first to enter the city, technically. The Russians would soon find themselves in a huge crossfire, however, between the courtyard and the inner outer door, killing 26 Russians and wounding 102. Yes, you see, there are basically two large gates, and they were now stuck. The survivors would be pinned down for many hours. MacDonald got his men together to raise the Stars and Stripes, the Union Jack, and the Imperial Eagle of Russia atop the Tartar walls to signal the advancing allies. Upon seeing this, the Qing siege forces went into a frenzy last-ditch assault upon the legations. It was to be known as the Three Terrible Nights, as Captain Poole wrote, "Legation full of danger, up all night, fiercest attack I can remember. Let them do their worst." The Qing artillery began smashing the Fu Palace as the Qing riflemen fired upon anyone they could see. In the midst of the chaos, a messenger from the Zhongliamen showed up bearing a note stating, "Dating from today, neither Chinese nor foreigner would ever again hear the sound of a rifle." Meanwhile, Colonel Shiba was ordering men to bang pots and pans while the Italians shouted and whistled, trying to convince the Qing soldiers they were a far larger force than they actually were. MacDonald called upon reserves 3 times, trying to rush forces to critical points. Qing riflemen armed with Mannlicher carbines were storming through the Mongol market with a large modern piece of artillery that was deployed upon a high point on the imperial city's wall. It was a 2-inch quick-firing Krupp gun, which did more damage in 10 minutes than the Qing had done in over 5 weeks. The foreigners unleashed their Colt machine gun and Maxim guns upon it, but they were met back with Mannlichers, Mausers, Jingals, and older muskets. Bricks and stones exploded. Hand-to-hand combat erupted. Then suddenly, through all of the chaos, the sound of heavy artillery could be heard coming from the east. A sudden lull began on both sides, until the foreigners in the legations realized it was the relief force outside the city. They were engaging the Qing troops. The news spread from building to building. MacDonald watched as the legation guards all suddenly became alive again. Everyone was joyous. They all wondered whose national army would come first. As news spread that the Russians had already stormed the Zhongbian Gate, the race had begun. The Japanese march turned into a rapid sprint, followed by the Americans. General Gasly refused to believe the Russians had abandoned the plan, but when he himself heard the sounds of artillery hitting Beijing's walls, well, he was pretty pissed off. At 3:30 a.m. on August the 14th, the British main body was 6 miles outside Beijing. They marched upon Guangzhou, and General Gasly had 2 artillery pieces brought straight up. According to Lieutenant Steele, which is a pretty awesome name to have in the military, the battery fired some dozen shots, and the Chinese scuttled, and we burst the door open and were inside. Keyes took a Union Jack and scaled the wall just right of the gate, placing it atop. Keyes had hoped to hop down and open the gate for his comrades, but they had busted it open before he could do so. Gasly dispatched 2 detachments through the breach to seize the temples of heaven and agriculture as the rest of the main body proceeded westwards towards the Tartar wall. Lieutenant Colonel Vaughan described the scene. Not a Chinaman was to be seen, but the banging of doors was heard, and many of the rings hanging from the doorknobs were shaking as we passed, showing that the doors had only just been shut. At last we entered a long and broad street. While going up it, saw hundreds of Chinamen running down the sides of the streets away from us. The British force estimated they were lined up with the sluice gate, which was also called the water gate, which led to the legation quarters. They turned north as Ching troops fired down upon them from houses. But, as noted by Keyes, we saw no troops and there was no real opposition. As they approached the Tartar wall, they came under heavy fire from the outer gate of Hatamen. The Ching were using smokeless powder, making it very difficult to see where the shots were all coming from. As the British got closer to the legations, they saw the American, Russian, and British flags atop the Tartar wall, indicating where the sluice gate was. Lieutenant Steele described this scene as the men went towards the sluice gate. We all dashed across the canal, bullets fizzing and spitting all around. A small shell exploding right in front of my nose. No harm done. It's unclear who exactly was the first man to enter the British legation, but according to Mrs. Keir, a British diplomat's wife, it was a Sikh, an unforgettable sight, naked to the waist, sweating like a pig, hair tumbling on his shoulders. He kept waving his rifle and shouting, "Hurrah!" And in a bunch with officers and men, that old darling, General Gasly, about 25 yards behind. The besieged foreigners were in a daze. Shortly before 2 p.m., MacDonald received news that foreign troops were beneath the Tartar wall opposite of the sluice gate. MacDonald rushed over just in time to greet General Gasly. MacDonald led the force to the British legation. 2 hours after the British arrived, General Chaffee and the 14th U.S. Infantry arrived, who were also quickly brought over to the British legation. The Americans, led by the 14th Infantry, had reached the walls of Beijing, only to find the Russians stuck in the Dongbian Gate. The Russians had assumed they would storm right into the city, but instead they were being torn to pieces from wall-top riflemen. General Vasilevsky was hit in the chest by a Mannlicher as he tried to rally his men on the lower parts of the wall. The main body of Russians only reached his vanguard force at 10 a.m. The Americans proceeded to scale the wall just a bit south of Dongbian's Gate, taking some of the pressure off the Russians. A 20-year-old bugler, Calvin Titus, volunteered to scale the wall first. Unarmed, he climbed the wall, earning himself a Congressional Medal of Honor and an appointment at West Point for the action. When he got to the top, he signaled to the rest to start climbing, and by 11 a.m., the regimental flag was flying over the walls of Beijing. By 12, U.S. forces were charging Qing soldiers atop the walls around the Dongbian Gate, and the Americans advanced through the southeast of the Tartar city too, which they became embroiled in some street fighting for. It took hours for them to work their way over to the Tartar wall. When they got through the sluice gate, they then realized the British had won the race after all. The Japanese, meanwhile, encountered very stiff resistance at their assigned gate, the Chaoyang. The Qing had hit the incoming Japanese with artillery, greatly stalling them. Just a little bit of a side note, actually, the Chinese particularly wanted to hurt the Japanese as they approached Beijing as kind of, revenge for the last war they just had. Despite the relief forces getting into the legations, the siege was still raging on. As Lieutenant Steele remarked, everyone was talking and cheering and waving their hats whilst the bullets were flying thick overhead and banging on the roofs all high. No one caring a damn. The Chinese simply went mad when they realized we were in and let off every bally gun that they had at random. Colonel Shiba launched a frontal attack on the Qing barricades at the Fu Palace, driving off the soldiers. The relief forces went to work, clearing snipers out of the Mongol market, who were shocked as hell upon seeing them. They had no idea Beijing had even been breached. As Captain Poole blasted a hole right through the Imperial Carriage Park wall and stormed through it with 60 Marines, he discovered 2 mines with powder and fuse lying about. He would later remark, "If the troops had come one day or one night later, God only knows what the results would have been." Upon seeing the British troops enter the sluice gate, the Qing began lowering banners atop the Tartar wall, and they withdrew. American and Russian forces surged forward as hundreds of Qing soldiers fled for their lives. The British, Russians, Japanese, Americans, and French forces went to work securing gates of the city and were actively fighting their way to the imperial court. Lennox Simpson was at the Hotel du Peking, where he found Russian soldiers getting drunk and openly discussing plans, and he had this to say. "The Russians had attempted to steal a march on the night of the 13th in order to force the eastern gates and reach the imperial city and the Empress Dowager before anyone else. That had upset the whole plan of attack, and there had simply been a mad rush, everyone going as hard as possible, and trusting to Providence to pull them through." The Russians had managed to enter the legations an hour before the Americans, while the Japanese had the most frustrating time getting in. George Lynch, accompanying the Japanese, described their attempts to blow the Chaoyang Gate. "The Japanese engineers went forward one by one until 20 minutes passed and expanded into half an hour. With cheerful and unwavering gallantry, these men went forward to blow up that gate, across the open space over the bridge, from which they could be fired upon by hundreds of Chinese. The attempt was absolutely hopeless. It was not that there was any wavering amongst them after 10 had been shot, but it was a task that the bravest man could not accomplish. Working like marionettes, they fired their guns again and again, but they were of very light caliber. Little war dogs spat their rather impotent projectiles against the great mass of centuries-old masonry. They might as well have been firing pea shooters. Yes, the real problem was the Japanese didn't have enough time to bring up actual heavy artillery, and they were using very small firearms to try and break a gate that, as you can imagine, was very thick. It took the Japanese until 9 p.m. to blast through the wooden doors. And just to add again, like I said, the Qing particularly wanted to get revenge on them, so they had put a lot of troops near that gate. They then stormed the city, skewering Qing soldiers upon their bayonets until they reached the legation. Meanwhile, the French were the very last. They only arrived to Beijing a day late because their route went over a marsh. The battle to seize Beijing claimed 66 foreign lives and 150 wounded. Simply astonishing when you think about it. The losses to the Qing are pretty unknown, but expected to be quite high. While Beijing was being seized, the work of the Eight-Nation Alliance was not done just yet. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to have a more visual account of the storming of Beijing? Then go over and check out my episode on the Boxer Rebellion. Also, if you find the time, check out my Patreon at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel channel for exclusive podcasts. And so, at last, the Eight-Nation Alliance had made it to the great walled city of Beijing. The British, Russian, Japanese, American, and French stormed Beijing's outer walls to rescue the foreign legations. But what of Empress Dowager Cixi?